The morning after the funeral in the long gallery at Marbury Hall, a woman in a black gown stood before 11 seated people and was told that her marriage had never happened. She was 24 years old. Her name was Clara Whitlow, and until 9 days before she had signed it, Clara Fenn. And the ink of that second signature had dried in a parish register in a village called Ashcombe on a wet Tuesday in October. Witnessed, entered, and closed. The register had been carried to the vestry chest. The chest had a lock. The lock had a key, and the key hung on a ring in the vicar's pocket, and none of that mattered now because the page on which her name had been written was not in the chest, and the vicar was dead of the same fever that had taken her husband, and the woman seated at the head of the gallery had folded her hands in her lap and said, quite pleasantly, that, of course, everyone felt for the girl, but a claim was not a marriage. Lady Honoria Fenn was 61. She wore grey silk and one ring. She had buried a brother, a sister-in-law, and now a nephew. And she had learned somewhere in that long attrition that grief properly managed was a species of authority. She did not raise her voice. She had never in her life needed to raise her voice. "There is no entry," she said. "There is no license lodged. There is a girl from a curate's house who lived 4 months in my nephew's care. I am not without sympathy. I am simply not without eyes." Clara did not move. That was the thing the room noticed afterward, the thing the housekeeper reported to the kitchen, and the kitchen reported to the village. She did not weep, and she did not argue. Her hands stayed exactly where they were, folded at the waist of a borrowed black gown that had been let out at the seams by a maid who had done her best. Her heart was going in her throat so hard she could hear it behind her own ears. Her face gave nothing. Across the gallery, standing at the window, with his back to the light, a man in a dark coat had not spoken since the reading began. His name was Nicholas Fenn, and 11 days ago he had been a soldier's brother, and nothing else in particular, and now he was the 7th Duke of Marbury, and the estate, the entail, the aunt. And this woman's fate had all arrived in his hands together, like a tray a servant had let fall. He was watching Clara's hands. Stay with this one. The room had already decided what she was. It was wrong, and it would take 4 months and a great deal of quiet to prove it. The village called her the curate's girl. That was how it started. And that was how it would go on. And Clara had heard the phrase in 3 different mouths before she understood that it was not a description but a verdict. Her father had been curate at Ashcombe for 19 years, on £80 a year, and the tithe of a garden. He had taught her Latin because there was no one else to teach, and he could not bear an unused mind. He had died in the spring, and the living had gone to a younger man with a wife, and Clara had been given until Michaelmas to leave the house she had been born in. She had catalogued the parish library in her last 3 weeks there, out of no motive she could name, simply because the books had been badly shelved for a decade, and she could not leave them so. That was the sort of thing she did. It was also, though she did not know it, the sort of thing that would matter later. Edward Fenn, 6th Duke of Marbury, had come to Ashcombe in August to see a horse, and had stayed 4 days because of the rain. He was 39, and he had been ill for a year, in a way he described to no one. He had found Clara in the vestry with the register open, correcting a burial entry that had been misdated by the previous incumbent, and he had asked her what she was doing, and she had answered him without looking up, and that she thought afterward was the whole of it. Nobody had asked her a question in a year that was not about where she would go. They had married in October. It had been quiet, and it had been quick, and both of those facts had been used against her since. He was dead by the 28th of the same month. She had 4 months of a marriage, and a widow's black, and a name the world had not agreed to give her, and in the space between his death and the reading of the will, a page had gone out of a chest with a lock on it. Nicholas had come home from Spain in June, with a limp he did not explain, and a habit of standing where the light was behind him. He had not expected the title. He had expected to bury his brother, sell his commission, and go north to a small property that had been left him by an uncle, and instead he found himself in a gallery full of Fenns being asked to decide, by his silence, whether a woman was his brother's widow or his brother's mistake. "You will want her removed before the tenant's dinner," Lady Honoria said to him in the study that evening, in the tone of a woman confirming a dinner order. "The curate's girl is not a difficulty. She is an embarrassment, and embarrassments harden if you leave them." He was standing at the fire, with his back to her. He did not turn. "She stays until the matter is settled," he said. "There is nothing to settle." "Then it will settle quickly." He had not defended her. Clara, hearing of it 2 days later from the housekeeper, understood that perfectly well. He had not said she was his brother's wife. He had said the matter was unsettled, which was another way of saying that she might be nothing, and that he had not yet made up his mind, and that she would live in this house under that suspended sentence for as long as it amused him to let it hang. She was given a room on the second floor at the back over the laundry, where the pipes knocked. She was given no allowance. She kept her father's watch, which had a cracked crystal and had not run since March, in her pocket, and she took it out sometimes and turned it over and did not wind it. There was a boy in the house. His name was Tom Prater, and he was 9, and he was the son of the head groom, and he had been born with a foot that turned in, and he could not run with the other boys, so he had learned to be quiet in doorways instead. He was the first person at Marbury Hall who spoke to Clara. As though she were a person, he found her in the library. On the 4th morning in the cold, with a lamp she had not been given permission to light, standing on a chair. "They'll say, 'You shouldn't be in here,'" Tom said. "They will," Clara agreed. "Hand me that one." The library at Marbury Hall was 40 feet long and 2 stories high, and had not been catalogued since 1781. There were 11,000 volumes in it and no list of them, and the ladder rails were seized with rust, and somebody had at some point shelved the entire Fenn family's legal papers behind a run of sermons where no one would ever find them, which is a thing that happens in houses where nobody reads. Clara began, without asking anyone, to catalogue it. She did it because the books had been badly shelved for 40 years, and she could not leave them so. She did it in the mornings before the house woke, and in the evenings by one candle she paid for out of the sale of a ribbon. She did it in a hand her father had taught her, in a ledger she found empty in a drawer, and she did not tell a soul. And Tom carried volumes to her from the high shelves that she could not reach, because his arms were good, even if his foot was not, and neither of them mentioned to anyone that this was going on. Nicholas found out in the 2nd week. He came into the library at 5:30 in the morning because he did not sleep, and the library was the only room in the house where nothing had belonged to his brother. There was a candle burning at the long table. There was a woman in a black gown with her sleeves pushed back and ink on the side of her hand, and a boy asleep in a chair with his bad foot up on a footstool, covered with her shawl. She stood when she saw him. She put the pen down. "I beg your pardon," she said. "I will go." "Sit down," he said. She sat, because the voice was one that did not consider the alternative. She hated it. Her face went warm at the hairline, and she despised that too. The body's small treachery, the way it answered a command her mind had already refused. He came to the table and looked at the ledger. 240 entries. Author, title, edition, shelf, condition in a hand better than his steward's. How long? 12 days. Why? She considered several answers and gave him the true one, which was a mistake she made rarely. Because it is the only thing in this house that is mine to do. He said nothing for a while. The boy breathed in the chair. Somewhere below them, a door closed. "Eat something," he said, and went out. A tray came up at 7. Bread, cold beef, a pot of tea, with 2 cups on the tray, and only one person in the room to drink from them. There was no note with it. She ate, all of it. She was ashamed of how much of it she ate, and then she was ashamed of being ashamed. And then she took the 2nd cup off the tray and washed it in the basin and put it back, so that whoever collected the tray would not be able to tell anyone anything. That was the first of them. There would be others, and Clara would read every one of them as coldness, as a man giving orders to a problem, and the household would read them as the Duke, tolerating an inconvenience, and only one person in Marbury Hall would have read them correctly. And he was not saying anything at all. The Dowager's second lever arrived in November, and her name was Miss Georgiana Vale. She was 22, and she had been raised on the certainty that she would be a duchess, in the way that some girls are raised, on the certainty that they will be tall. Her mother had been Lady Honoria's dearest friend. Her fortune was £11,000. She played the pianoforte very well, and she was not stupid, which made her worse, because she could see exactly what was being arranged around her and had decided that it suited her. She arrived with 3 trunks and stayed for the winter. Clara carried up the second of those trunks herself, because 2 footmen were at the stable, and the housekeeper had looked at her, and then looked away, and there was a moment on the back stairs when Clara understood that she had just been assigned her position in the house without a word being spoken. The trunk had a brass plate on it with initials. She set it down in the blue bedroom, which had a fire in it, and she went back up to the room over the laundry, where the pipes knocked, and where there was not one. At the first dinner of her visit, with 14 at table, and the candles doubled in the mirrors and the footmen going round with the second course, Lady Honoria turned her head very slightly toward the middle of the table and said, in the clear, untroubled voice of a woman commenting on the weather, "You must not mind, Clara. The curate's girl has no conversation, but she has been very useful about the books." The table heard it. The table was meant to hear it. Clara, seated below the salt in a black gown 4 years out of fashion, felt the sentence arrive in her chest like cold water. She did not put down her fork. She finished the mouthful she had taken, and she set the fork on the plate, and she looked at the woman at the head of the table, and she said nothing at all. And Georgiana laughed, once, prettily, into her glass. At the far end of the table, the Duke of Marbury's hand stopped on the stem of his wineglass. It stopped for perhaps 2 seconds. Nobody saw it, but Clara, who had known exactly where he was in the room since she entered it. The way one knows where a fire is. He did not speak. He drank the wine. She lay awake that night with the pipes knocking under the floor, and told herself what she had been telling herself for 6 weeks, that a man does not defend a thing he has not decided to keep, that she was a matter unsettled, that the warmth in her face when his voice came into a room was the last vanity of a woman who had run out of everything else. She put her hand flat on her own breastbone in the dark, the way her father used to when he could not sleep, and she counted the beats until they slowed, and they did not slow for a long while. Downstairs somebody was playing the pianoforte very well, and very late. She lay and listened to a woman with £11,000 play a piece Clara had learned at 9 years old, on a spinet with 3 dead keys, and she found to her own disgust that she could not hate her for it. She was wrong about him. She was so thoroughly wrong about him that she would not understand the size of it for another 11 weeks. It happened on the 4th of December in the stable yard, and he was not supposed to be there at all. Tom had been sent to muck out the loose boxes, and had been at it 2 hours in the wet when Georgiana's mare came in lame. And Georgiana, who was not cruel, only certain, said in front of the yard that the boy had led the horse over the flint, and that his foot made him careless, and that her father would not have kept such a boy. The head groom was Tom's father. He stood in the yard with his hat in his hand and did not say a word, because a groom does not contradict a lady with £11,000, and everybody in the yard understood that, including Tom, who was 9, and who had gone the color of the wall. Clara had come out for the eggs. She had no standing in that yard at all. She was a woman with no name and no allowance in a borrowed cloak, and the correct action, the action any sensible person in her position takes, was to keep walking. She crossed the yard. "The mare came in lame on Tuesday," she said. "The boy did not lead her Tuesday. I did. She was favoring the near 4 before she left the box, and I said so to Mr. Des. Prater and he sent for the farrier, and the farrier came Wednesday and found a stone bruise 4 days old, which puts it before the boy touched her at all." Georgiana looked at her. "And who are you," she said, "to know anything of horses?" "Nobody," Clara said. "The farrier is Mr. Hale of Ashcombe. He will remember. He wrote it in his book. There was a silence in the yard of the specific kind that happens when a person of no consequence has said something that is going to be checked and found true. Georgiana went in. She did not apologize. She was not a person who had ever needed the skill, and she went up the steps and through the door, and the door shut, and that was the whole of her part in it. The head groom put his hat on. He did it slowly, with both hands, the way a man does when he is making certain his hands have something to do. He did not look at Clara. He would not look at her for another 3 days. When he finally did, in the passage by the dairy, all he said was that the eggs were on the shelf where she liked them, which was, from that man, a speech. Tom stood in the wet with his fists shut and did not cry until Clara had gone into the dairy, and then he cried hard, with his forehead against the cold stone of the door frame, and she let him, and she did not tell anyone that either. She stood beside him and did not touch him, because he was 9, and he was his father's son, and he would have hated it. When he had finished, he wiped his face with his sleeve, and asked her whether she wanted the eggs in the basket or the apron, and she said the basket, and that was the end of the conversation. He had been standing inside the arch of the stable block for the whole of it, out of the rain, where no one had seen him. He did not come out. He stood there for some minutes after the yard had cleared, looking at nothing. Then he went in and wrote to Mr. Hale of Ashcombe, and asked, in 4 lines, for a copy of an entry in a farrier's book, and did not tell anyone why. The thing he had never told anyone came out in January, and it came out because she found it, and she was not looking for it. She was in the library at 6 in the morning, on the ladder, at the section behind the sermons where the family papers had been shelved by somebody with no idea what they were doing. She was pulling out bound quartos and reading the spines and finding leases, surveys, 100 years of correspondence, and behind them, flat against the back of the shelf where it had slid, a portrait miniature in a case, face down. She turned it over. A woman of perhaps 25. Dark hair, a green gown. Somebody had painted her mouth as though she had been about to speak. "Put that down," Nicholas said from the doorway. She had not heard him come in. She came down the ladder with the case in her hand, and she did not put it down because she had heard something in his voice that was not command. He crossed the room and took it from her. His hand was not steady. She saw that. He saw her see it. Her name was Anne Carew, he said. And his voice was level. And level was the worst thing it could have been. She was to have married me in the spring of the year 8. I was ordered to Portugal in the February. I asked her to wait. She waited 14 months, and her father died, and there was nothing left, and her cousin offered for her. And she wrote to me to ask what she should do, and the letter reached me in June, and I answered it in June, and she was married in the April and dead of a fever in the September, and I have never been able to decide. And here he stopped, and started again, and Clara watched a man put a lid back on something. Whether the answer would have made any difference at all, he put the miniature in his breast pocket. "I do not leave a question hanging," he said. "Not since." "That is all." He went out. Clara stood in the cold library, with her hands still shaped, around a thing that was no longer in it, and every command he had given her in 3 months turned over in her mind and came up showing a different face. "Sit down. Eat something. Come inside. Stay until the matter is settled." Not a man deciding whether to keep her. A man who had learned exactly once at a cost. He had not survived. What it means to leave a woman's future undecided while he waited to be sure. She went and sat down at the long table and put her face in her hands for a moment. 1 moment. And then she got up and went back to the ladder, because she was not a woman who wept in libraries, and because there were 400 volumes left in that section, and she had promised nobody but herself that she would finish it. If this is the kind of story you stay for, stay a little longer. She was 11 days from the worst night of her life. Lady Honoria did not think of herself as a liar. She had thought of herself on the night of the 29th of October, standing in a vestry in Ashcombe with a dead vicar in the next room, and a lock she had not needed to break because the key was on the ring in his coat, as a woman preventing a catastrophe. Her brother's title had gone to a boy who had spent 9 years being shot at. The estate carried debts of £41,000. There was one clean way out, and it was Georgiana's 11,000 and her mother's connections. And standing directly in the middle of that road was a curate's daughter, with 4 months of marriage, and a claim on a jointure the estate could not pay. She had taken 1 page. She had not burned it. She was not a woman who burned things. She was a woman who filed them. It was in the japanned box in her dressing room, under the deeds of a property in Suffolk, and it had been there since November. She had slept perfectly well every night. The Marbury Ball was held on the 12th of February as it had been held on the 12th of February for 60 years. 90 people. The gallery cleared. The chandeliers down and cleaned and up again, 400 candles, the orchestra from Norwich, the terrace doors black with the night behind them, and the fires banked so high in both hearths that the far end of the room was a wall of heat. Clara was not to have gone. She had no gown. She had been told in a note in the dowager's hand that her presence would be understood as an intrusion. She went, because Nicholas sent word at 4 o'clock that she would come down, and because she had spent 3 months learning what those flat commands were, and because some part of her that she had not consulted had already put on the black gown and pinned up her hair. She came down at 9. The staircase at Marbury Hall is 31 steps, and turns twice, and she took all of them without hurrying, because hurrying was the one thing she had left to refuse. She stood at the edge of it in 4-year-old black, with her father's watch in her pocket, and the heat came at her off 400 candles, and the orchestra was in the middle of something bright, and 90 people looked at her. The room did what rooms do. A fan came up. A conversation 2 yards to her left went on being had, in the same words at the same volume, by 2 people who were no longer listening to each other. Somebody laughed at the far end, and it was not about her, and it might as well have been. She did not leave. She had come down the 31 steps, and she was going to stand in the room for the length of one dance because that was the size of the thing she could still do. And she did it, and her hands stayed folded, and her heart went in her throat like something trying to get out. Lady Honoria came to her at 10:30, with Georgiana on her arm and 11 people within hearing. "My dear," she said, "you must let me speak plainly, since no one else will. There is no marriage. There never was. There is a curate's girl who was kind to a sick man for 4 months, and has told herself a story about it, and I do not blame you for the story, but I will not have it told in this house." On this night, the register is silent. Silence is an answer. And then, with the whole of that corner of the room listening, she said the thing she had been saving. "You have no name, child. You never had one. Go and be useful in the library where you are wanted, and let my nephew marry." Clara felt her own hand go to the chair back beside her. She felt her heart hitting her throat. She heard the small sound of 90 people deciding all at once that the old woman was right, because the old woman was always right, and because the girl had no answer. She had no answer. That was the truth of it, and there is no way to soften it. She stood in a room lit by 400 candles with the proof of her own name folded in a box 40 feet above her head, and she could not prove she had ever been anyone's wife, and Nicholas was not in the room. She went out through the terrace doors into the February air with her lungs not working properly. The cold took her across the face like water. Behind the glass, the room went on, the candles and the shoulders and the orchestra sawing away at a country dance. All of it, 4 inches and 1 pane away, and entirely finished with her. Her breath stood in the air. She put both hands on the stone balustrade, and the stone was so cold it burned, and she held on to it anyway, because she had gone slightly blind at the edges and she needed something in the world to be solid. She was Clara Whitlow again. That was what the old woman had done in 11 words, in a room of 90 people, without raising her voice. Tom, who was not supposed to be in the house at all, came out of the shadow by the balustrade because he had been watching through the glass. "It ain't true," he said. "It is true," Clara said. "I cannot prove it. Those are not the same thing. And tonight, they are the same thing." She said the other part very quietly, to the dark because it was the only place in England where she could say it. I did not mind being nobody. I minded it after he had made me somebody. That was the cruelty, not the beginning of it, the end. Tom looked at her for a moment with the particular clarity of a 9-year-old who has been told his whole life what he cannot do. The books behind the sermons, he said. You said they was all the family's papers. You said whoever put 'em there hid 'em by accident. They did, miss, said Tom. There's a box in her dressing room what she don't let the maids touch. Clara did not go up and take it. That is worth saying. Plainly. Because the temptation of the story is that she should have. She went to Nicholas instead at 7 the next morning, in the study, and she stood in front of the desk with her hands folded and said what she had, which was a boy's word about a box, and a shelf full of misfiled papers, and nothing else at all. I am not asking you to believe me, she said. I am asking you to send for the vicar's successor, and the parish clerk, and Mr. Parshar, Hale and anyone else who was in that church in October, and to have them say what they saw, and if they say nothing, then I will go, and I will go quietly, and you will never hear from me again. He looked at her for a long moment. The fire had been lit an hour, and the room was still cold. There was a tray at his elbow, with the food untouched on it, and she saw with a small shock that he had been up all night, and that whatever he had been doing with the night, it had not been sleeping through her humiliation. Sit down, he said. I would rather stand. Then stand, he said, and reached into his breast pocket, and put on the desk between them a folded paper in a farrier's hand, and a letter from a Mr. Precker. Hale of Ashcombe, and beneath those 3 more letters. From the parish clerk of Ashcombe, from a woman named Mrs. Bully, Betty Cowper, who had laid out the vicar's body, and from a man named Josiah Bell, who had been the second witness at a wedding on a wet Tuesday in October, and had signed his name in a register, with a pen that skipped. They were dated December, every one of them. You have had these since December, Clara said. Her voice did not sound like her own. Since the 4th of December, he said. I have been finding the page. A witness is a claim. A page is a fact. And my aunt is a careful woman. And I have had 11 weeks of looking in the wrong rooms. He stood. The boy has just given me the right one. The dowager's jointure was paid out of the estate. Her rooms at Marbury Hall were hers by her brother's will for her life. There was nothing anyone could take from Lady Honoria, and everybody in the county knew it, which was the whole basis of her confidence, and had been for 40 years. She was in the small drawing-room at 11 o'clock, with Georgiana at the pianoforte and 9 of the ball's guests still in the house and taking chocolate, when her nephew came in with the vicar of Ashcombe, the parish clerk, Mr. Shee, Josiah Bell in his good coat, and the family solicitor, Mr. Reeve, who had driven through the night from Norwich and looked it, and Clara, in black at the back, with her hands folded. Lady Honoria's fan came up to exactly the height. It always came up to. Nicholas, we are at chocolate. The box in your dressing room, he said. The japanned one, under the Suffolk deeds. That was the tell, and every person in the room saw it, because a fan that does not move in a room where a woman has just been named is a fan that has stopped. I do not know what you imagine you, Mrs. Two. Cowper has the vicar's keys, Nicholas said. She had them from his coat on the night of the 29th. She has told Mr. Reeve who else was in that vestry that night. There was one other person. She has named her. The pianoforte had stopped some while ago. Nobody had noticed when. Georgiana stood up from the bench. She looked at Lady Honoria for a long moment, and something in her face went through several stages very quickly, and came out the other side, as something Clara had not expected, which was shame. You told me the girl was lying, Georgiana said. The dowager's hand tightened on the fan. She began a sentence. She began it twice. It was, the estate is £41,000 in. The boy has been 9 years at war. He does not understand what a house. She stopped. She looked around the room and found 9 faces she had known for 40 years, and every one of them had turned, and she understood, all at once, in a way that no argument could have produced, that she had lost the room. Mr. Ross, the room, Reeve went up with the housekeeper. He came down in 4 minutes with a single page. He read the names on it aloud, because that is what a solicitor does, and the room heard the vicar's hand and Bell's skipped pen and Edward Fenn's signature, and beneath it, Clara's own, written in October, in a vestry in the rain. Nicholas Fenn crossed the room. He crossed it in 5 strides, past his aunt, past the pianoforte, past 9 people who had eaten his brother's food for 40 years, and he stopped in front of a woman in a black gown who had gone very white and very still, and the room held its breath. "My brother's widow stands in this house by right," he said. "Nothing further. Nothing further." 5 words after 7, and the room did not breathe. For the length of them, he offered her his arm. She looked at it. She was aware, distantly, of 9 people behind him, and of a solicitor holding a page, and of an old woman with a fan that had stopped, and none of it reached her. She looked at his face. What she found there was not triumph. It was not pity. It was the thing she had seen in the library in January, with the miniature shaking in his hand, and she had not had a name for it then, and she had one now, and the name was the reason a man writes to a farrier in December and says nothing about it for 11 weeks. She took his arm. Her hand was steady. She had time later to be surprised about that. Lady Honoria Fenn left Marbury Hall on the 1st of March for the house in Suffolk, which was hers, and which was warm, and which was 50 miles from anyone who had been in the drawing-room. She was not turned out. She was not ruined. Nicholas signed the order for her carriage himself, and stood in the door while it was loaded, and the 2 of them said nothing to each other at all. And at the last moment, she paused with her hand on the frame and looked back at the girl in black on the steps and said, "I have been wrong before. I have not often been shown it." Then she got in. Georgiana Vale wrote to Clara from London in April. It was 3 lines long, and it was an apology, and it was signed with her full name, and Clara kept it. They were married in the September in Ashcombe, in the church where the first one had happened, with 11 people present, and the same clerk and Bell in the same good coat. There was no announcement in the papers for a month. Nicholas had asked her what she wanted, and she had said, "Quiet," and he had said, "Quiet." And that had been the entire negotiation. He had asked her once, in June in the library, on the ladder with her hand on a shelf and his hand on the rail below it, and 11 inches of cold air between them that neither of them crossed. "I want you here," he had said, "not settled. Not arranged here, because I have not wanted anything for 9 years, and I want this, and I am telling you badly." Her hand had shut on the shelf edge. Her heart had gone in her throat the way it had gone the first night in the gallery, and she had understood the difference between the 2, which is that one of them was fear. "Say it again," she had said. He had said it again. She had come down 2 rungs and stopped, level with his face, close enough that she could feel the warmth coming off his coat, and she had not moved, and neither had he. And a pause held, and both of them knew what the next thing was, and both of them knew that it could not be unmade. He had kissed her at the foot of the ladder once, and it was soft, and it was full of promise, and it did not go further, because there was a boy asleep in a chair at the end of the room with his bad foot up on a footstool. By Christmas the catalogue was finished. 11,206 volumes, in her hand, in 9 ledgers, on a shelf in the library with the family papers properly boxed beside them, where anyone could find them, which was, she said, rather the point. Tom Prater was schooled at the Duke's expense, and made under-librarian at 15, and his father cried about it in the tack-room, where he thought nobody could hear. The last night of that year it snowed, and Clara Fenn came down at 6 in the morning because she still did not sleep past 6, and never would, and found the library fire already lit, and a lamp burning, and her husband asleep in the chair by the hearth with a book open on his chest and the miniature of Anne Carew on the table beside him, face up. Where it had been since February, because he had stopped turning it over. She stood in the door for a moment and watched the snow come down past the tall window, thick and unhurried, filling in the yard and the arch of the stable block and the flint path she had crossed in the wet in December to say 4 sentences to a woman who had not deserved them and had needed them anyway. The fire moved. Her husband did not wake. The book on his chest was the 4th volume of something she had catalogued in her own hand in January and shelved at eye height on the north wall, because she had known, even then, without permitting herself the thought, exactly whose eye. Then she took her father's watch out of her pocket, with its cracked crystal, and turned it over in her hand, and wound it, and it started. And it had not run since March of the year her whole life ended. She set it on the mantel where it could be heard. Thank you for staying to the end of this one. If Clara's quiet stayed with you, leave a word below with the moment that held you.